Welcome back. We got my dude, Matt Maruca. Oh, big stretch. We got my dude, Matt Maruca, back on the podcast. I think this is 3 or 4 times he's been on. What can I say? I mean, I've been calling this guy the boy genius since I started podcasting with him. I think he started podcasting as a guest on a lot of the who's who in podcasting. Luke Story's Lifestylist podcast must have been one of the first that I've heard him on. As an 18-year-old, really went through what would seem like a midlife crisis in his early teens at the beginning of high school, and with all things health going to hell and a whole bunch of shit, and really started, thankfully figured out very quickly that he wasn't going to find anything he needed to learn through what academics could teach him, and so he started riffing on his own, diving deep into books like Health and Light by John Ott, Dr. Jack Kruz's work, and many others, and just really carved a path for himself. And it's really cool because, even though he's been on a few times, we do cover the background of his trajectory, and I don't want to give that away. It's awesome. I think a lot of us, myself included, can come to the thing. This is the thing that matters. You're like, holy shit, I changed my diet. Holy shit, this is it. This is the thing. You find BFR training. I've been training with blood flow restriction lately. Like, holy shit, this is the thing. Everybody's got to do BFR. And it's like, well, it's actually all the things, and there are some really special the things that stand out to us, and for Matt, it started with diet, and then it progressed to different forms of light therapy and enhancing the circadian rhythm and the power of the sun and all sorts of cool shit that went flied right in the fucking face of what he was reading in school on UV light and all sorts of other information. But many little groundbreakers there started to get him to peel back the layer of what was being taught versus what actual health was. And from there, it continued to mature, and he got hooked up into Dr. Joe Dispenza's work. And I think he's been to like 9 or a dozen, something like that, of his seminars, advanced trainings, which is really remarkable. He's got the training down. He just keeps going back for like a touch-up, just to be in the presence of a master and to really hone and to participate in something with a large group of people. There is something to that. I talk with Matt a little bit about ayahuasca on this podcast because he doesn't have experience with it yet. But, you can have a great experience by yourself. You can do Terrence McKenna's heroic dose by yourself, and that'll fucking change your worldview in a heartbeat. 5 grams dried psilocybin, dark room, night, safe space, go. Like that will work. But to share a space on ayahuasca with 20 people, maybe you've never met them, maybe you brought a couple of people but you don't know the rest of them, or maybe it's a fucking hand-picked, curated group like I did with my last one at Soltara. You're sharing in an opening with a group of people, and that bonds you, and you get to feel into other people's experiences. And sometimes you're not certain if it's yours or if it's someone else's, and it's a whole thing, and it's a different thing, but it is a special thing. And I think Matt speaks to that as well. When you get into these higher levels of consciousness and awareness through Dispenza's practices, through meditation, through the breath, they're doing this with 1,000, 1,500 people in a whack, in these big ass conference centers. And that's a massive opening. That's a massive portal to go through with that many people. Walking meditations with hundreds of people on the beach, all stepping into the same resonance. It's really potent stuff. So Matt is also a guy who, whenever I see him, I know we've got more to talk about. I know that we're both, doing shit fairly constantly. Everyone is, but not everyone is constantly up-leveling or searching for new things or trying on to the degree that Matt and I try on things for size, and I think when you find something that works, as Matt has at different stages of his life, he's really embedded himself in that. He's discipled it. He's really not just tried it on for size, but come to understand something from the inside out by making it his own and really spending time as an apprentice and an adept in these different skill sets. So love having Matt on the show. Certainly won't be his last time. I'm sure in 6 months or a year, whenever we see each other next, he's going to have a whole host of other cool shit that he's into. So thank you, Matt, for coming on the show. We'll have links to all his stuff in the show notes. We give him shout outs at the end of that. Raw Optics is one of his companies. They've been a longtime show sponsor. They're the best in blue light blocking. So Check all that in the show notes. Without further ado, my brother, Matt Maruca. You're good, Guapo. We got Guapo man here at the farm. Just did a nice little tour, little walk. It's nice because quite a few people, I shouldn't say this about my guests. I have plenty of guests who would walk the land and get sweaty with me, but I don't often ask, pre-podcast. And I was like, oh, Matt's here. We'll fucking walk the land, get sweaty, jump in the pool, and then do the damn thing. So that was cool. And then it was great because I was like, I'd already done a couple laps with Guapo, and I was thinking, this will be nice because I can catch up with you. I haven't had a chance to catch up pre-podcast. And you, like maybe I don't know about a handful. You, like many of the guests that have been on the show, every time I meet you, you've never stopped doing shit. So like you're constantly on the path, constantly doing cool shit. So catch-up time's awesome, especially pre-podcast, to know where we're going to steer the ship. And all I did was blab about the farm the whole time, so I didn't get to hear anything. So
needed, man. There's so much to say. I mean, it's probably less than half of what there is to share. Probably much less. There's so much on the land.
Yeah.
You could take all day. You could walk me through,
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. But it is nice now that I get to hear and get caught up with you. Last time we talked about a ton of cool shit. I think that was their second or third time on the show. You had just made your way back from Russia and had some cool experiences there. Fill us in on what you've been up to, because you've been doing a lot. I think you just had your second Joe Dispenza advanced seminar that you had been to as well. So I know that's been a big piece of this. Not something I often talk about on the podcast, but something that I find myself teaching again and again in Fit for Service. It's like if somebody had read like the placebo effect or breaking the habit of being yourself back in the day, and I'm like, well, becoming supernatural is way better. And like there's online courses and meditations and just filling them in on stuff. But I myself have not been to one of the advanced classes yet. Aubrey and Caitlin have, and Caitlin said it absolutely fucking changed her life. I think Aubrey was already on that path in many regards and has no issues manifesting. So it was more of the same for him. But I think for many people, it's groundbreaking, and what it's illuminating to, and then I'll shut the hell up. What it's illuminating to is actually how we work with consciousness itself, how we work with spirit itself, right? Or the quantum, as he would call it. And I think that's where we start to get the woo-woo starts to hit, the rubber hits the road with science, and we start to see like there's some trackable shit here. And it's pretty remarkable, right? It's nothing shy of miracles. So I think that's really incredible. So I'm excited to dive into it, into that aspect with you. But fill us in, brother. Where you been, what you been doing, and let's take the deep dive.
Man, well, first of all, thank you for showing me the farm. It's amazing what you guys are building. For me, everything's been great. I feel really blessed. I've had several years since I started my company, just free to travel, free to explore. And, I had this amazing experience where I learned about diet, because when I was younger, I had some health challenges. I was reading everything I could, and diet led to stricter diets, and then led to getting, into that orthorexic, obsessive mindset about diets, and just always looking for the next thing. Like this can't be it. There's got to be more than just, the autoimmune paleo diet and this and that. But at the time, I was following this information like it was the truth from the guru, whoever was teaching about the information. And then I learned about light, and that was a huge evolution, I would say, like a paradigm shift for me, because we're not just these chemical beings. There's actually energy behind life, and that's one of the most fascinating things I ever learned. There's a great book called The Body Electric by Robert O. Becker. It's kind of one of the classics in energy medicine. And in the intro, I recommend anybody even just read the intro and the outro to that book, because he basically frames it and says, listen, for hundreds of years since science basically became a concept and people studied life, way back in the day, there was this group of scientists called the mechanists who basically believed that biology is mechanistic, it's chemical, it's very simple, and you can reduce it down to the chemicals and that's it. And then there was this other group called the vitalists, and the vitalists basically said, well, there's got to be something more to life than just chemicals. There has to be something deeper that's organizing it all. But in the 1600s, 1700s, they didn't have equipment that was sensitive enough to measure energy, really. They just could see chemicals because they're bigger, they're easier to perceive. And so the mechanists continually won out, and they even won out more recently with the advent of penicillin around 100 years ago, when there were all these other treatments for health and wellness, for treating different diseases. There was for example, acupuncture, Ayurvedic medicine, traditional plant medicines, heliotherapy. These guys in Switzerland use sunlight to heal really sick people. And then penicillin comes out and they think, oh my gosh, all of the biggest killers of the time, all the bacterial infections, we can literally use a pinch of white powder and cure that. So it was like the ultimate triumph of medicine in their mind. We've basically solved it and we can move on. And around that time, there's the interesting story I imagine you've heard where Rockefeller had this idea, well, I've captured the oil industry. Why don't I move into pharmaceuticals? And I
haven't told this story much because I've seen it in different documentaries and it's verified. It's been verified so many fucking times that it's like, how people can't put two and two together on this is mind-blowing, but please illuminate and I'll act like I don't know shit. Yeah, this is great.
So I have even a cursory understanding I think is enough for people, but basically he hired a guy named Abraham Flexner who wasn't a scientist. Basically he was just a journalist or something like this, and Rockefeller hired him to basically write this report for Congress and say, listen, all of this other stuff is not really evidence-based. So they're basically making the case that unless you can do a clinical trial, placebo-controlled drug trial, which they still do, that's the main basis for modern Western medicine, unless you can do that with a drug, then it's really not evidence-based. And I would say evidence-based is a euphemism for, we have millions of dollars to fund these studies, and if you don't, then your stuff's woo-woo, unscientific.
Yeah, they call it alternative.
Exactly, alternative medicine. And so they actually basically threw all of that out. And to this day, until really recently, you wouldn't even have a traditional doctor prescribing acupuncture or anything like that because it was considered not evidence-based medicine, right? Alternative. And so in a way, the mechanistic perspective of life won out because things were pretty good for that period. Well, then we have this issue in the United States, and I meant to mention to you earlier, I recently listened to RFK on the Rogan podcast, and that's mind-blowing. And I was sitting there like, finally, somebody's talking about this on a mainstream level. And he explains very, very well stuff I read about now almost 10 years ago when I was just getting into this, how basically all of the main regulatory bodies in the United States are captured by the industries. So EPA is captured by oil and gas and coal. You have the FCC supposed to regulate telecom. Instead, they just blow the doors open for telecom to do whatever they want, 5G, you name it. The FDA is obviously captured by the pharmaceutical industry.
The FDA is the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, it is. And the pharmaceutical industry is the FDA. If you can see memes of this that are completely verifiable of who has switched, former lead at FDA becomes CEO for such and such company, Merck, fucking Pfizer, whatever. Former lead board member from Pfizer steps in as lead board member for FDA. Like it's just fucking the musical chairs game. It's comical.
Yep. Yeah, and same with the FCC and telecommunications. So the head guy, one of the head guys in the industry, became the head regulator, head of the FCC, chairman of the FCC, and that's obviously a bit of an issue. And they actually used that to push through 5G and everything. So anyway, what happened with this capture is that obviously, as RFK outlines very nicely, they blew the doors open for vaccine production, for example, right? And it happens in every industry. But so humans in the States in particular, where this is the case, in Europe they have a lot of issues. But one thing that I think Europe's a little bit better about is that they are protecting people in certain respects.
Now, in particular with food and things like that.
Exactly, right? There's plenty of other issues in Europe. The mindset that there's really high taxes and it's more of a socialist type of culture. But that being said, they have certain things right? The food's a little, generally better, less GMO. Even with, for example, wine production. In Europe, it's generally illegal to irrigate wine. I found this fascinating because when you irrigate wine, you increase the yield. We were talking about, rain determines the yield out here. But when you do the same with wine, you can increase the production, but it dilutes essentially the quality of the wine, right? So in Europe, it's actually, for the most part, still illegal to irrigate, and all the wine is dry farmed, so rainwater only. And the roots go deeper into the ground, and they capture more nutrients. The water table, they capture more nutrients from the soil. Anyway, so really interesting stuff. So as this happened, there was this massive explosion of chronic illnesses in the United States, and you can't treat chronic illnesses with penicillin. So I think it's really cool to see that now, less than 100 years since penicillin, there's now this massive search going on again for people who are interested in health because they've gotten sick. And I've spoken to multiple people, billionaires recently, who I've spent time with, who, for example, have some sort of chronic illness. And, no matter how much money they could throw at it with traditional medicine, they don't have any answers. They just say, you're going to have to live with this. So when Becker explains this, mechanists versus vitalists, for me, it's such a beautiful way to frame a whole conversation, because for the longest time, and even still today, the mainstream view that everybody keeps sharing, not everybody, but in our world, it's the opposite, right? But in the mainstream, it's mechanism, evidence-based medicine, drugs, etc. But the vitalists, those who thought and understood that there was more to life than just chemicals, were correct in the end. And Becker showed this in his book, how when he would amputate salamanders, because he was trying to figure out, well, how can they regenerate a whole limb? Maybe we could learn something about ourselves from that, because he did residency during one of the World War II in Manhattan. He's lots of amputations, and he was thinking, well, how in the world can a salamander regenerate? Maybe we could do that too with technology. They actually, on a dog, they regenerated an entire limb, and it was the first time it was done in mammals. They did this using that technology he had developed, but interestingly enough, this is a whole tangent, but it was stifled because his predecessor, or I should say successor, his protege, Andrew Marino, started questioning, well, wait a minute. We have this super delicate electrical system in our body. Maybe, just maybe, these high voltage transmission lines that put off these fields that stretch a mile because they're carrying 750,000 volts of electricity, maybe that could affect these delicate systems that are operating at fractions of the intensity. And sure enough, they found all these effects. And then when they went to present the evidence in court cases defending these people, the judges actually and the juries would actually favor them because they seemed like they knew what they were talking about. But the legal standard at the time for admitting scientific evidence into the court of law was that if it isn't generally accepted by the scientific community, it can't be used as evidence. And so that this is all just so people understand, because science and law are two totally different disciplines. And the reason that standard existed was from the early 1900s. Somebody was apparently guilty of murder. It appeared that they were guilty. The evidence was stacked very much in that direction. And then the scientists that this guy hired, or his team hired, brought in this sort of lie detector box that was pretty obviously to everybody involved a farce, kind of a lie in and of itself. And the judge had to figure out a way to throw that evidence out of the courtroom, because of course they say, well, I'm credentialed in this and that way and I've developed this lie detector box. But everybody's like, listen, this guy's pretty clearly guilty. And so anyway, the judge then, his last name is Fry, he created this ruling that is, as I just said, if it's not generally accepted by the scientific community, we're going to throw it out. So this lie detector box wasn't. So that was an easy way to say, let's throw this out. Now the problem comes 60, 70 years later when they have these court cases around EMF. These scientists, Marino and Becker, who wrote The Body Electric, had actually done authentic research on this. It still wasn't generally accepted, though, because it just wasn't in the mainstream yet. It was new, but it was very well done science. They fought and fought and fought in the legal battles. Ultimately, they lost over and over again. The electrical power companies won out, and that laid the ground for the development of cell phones, microwaves, and all this stuff that's kind of permeated our environment. And years later, there was a court case that was actually a very emotional subject. There was a woman who had taken a morning sickness drug during her pregnancy, and her child came out with severe birth defects. And the family name was Daubert. And so Daubert sued Merrill Dow Pharmaceutical. And this is a Supreme Court case in 98 or 99. And basically, the Supreme Court told the team, listen, it's pretty clear that this caused this issue. Now, Merrill Dow, using the Fry standard, could have hired, and they did, many scientists from all these different institutions with credentials say, listen, I'm from Yale, Stanford, Harvard, you name it, Princeton, and we don't see how this could have caused this. It's not generally accepted, right? And if they were to go off the Fry standard, they would have basically lost. But it was so obvious that the court said, listen, we're going to rule in your favor, but you guys need to come up with an explanation for how we can frame this properly for a new standard. So that legal team went to this guy, Marino, who had more experience than anybody else in this interplay between law and science. He was a PhD and a JD, so he had both degrees, law and science. And basically, he said to them, listen, you need to get the Supreme Court to understand that scientific knowledge and knowledge in general isn't the result of people agreeing on it. That'd be like saying you and I agree that, that chlorine is good for you, and then it's true. No, it's the result of the methods used to obtain it, is what he said, the scientific methods. So in other words, these researchers shouldn't just say, I'm from Yale, and so you should believe me because I'd say this and this. Actually, they have to explain in a court case why they know, how they know what they know. and why it's true. And then actually the jury gets to make up their mind. And so this is the Daubert standard that took over. Now, it's interesting, and RFK mentioned this. So when he was sharing this on the podcast, I was thinking, this is so big, bigger than I think most people realize, that this is now on Rogan. It's going mainstream. RFK talked about what's called a Daubert hearing. So what they implemented was, before a scientist can come up, because any scientist with a lawyer behind them can pretty easily persuade a jury about anything, right, if they have this credential and this and that. So they actually go to the judge first with the jury not present, and they have to present the evidence to the judge, and the judge gets to decide, and assuming hopefully the judges are relatively moral, uncorrupt people, they get to actually say, yeah, listen, we're going to allow this to be presented to the jury. So it's a Daubert hearing of the science, and then the scientists can actually present the information, and the jury gets to make a decision based on the evidence themselves, which is how it should be, I think. For if you're going to have a jury judge on a case, then they should essentially have the ability to kind of feel who's right. So anyway, that is the status of the legal system in the United States and its interplay with science. And for me, that was a really interesting thing. So anyway, back to my story. This is something I was learning about. I was reading this book. Andrew Marino wrote a book. So the successor of Becker, he wrote a book called Going Somewhere, Truth About a Life in Science. I recommend everyone who's interested read that book, because it explains, for those who are open-minded to this, they can understand actually how it works and have the language to, tell their family and friends about how corrupt the scientific industry can be and how it can also be good. But for those who are skeptical, you can actually see how it works. The way that the FDA, for example, is so corrupt. They had really great treatments that they were trying to push through using electricity, and they were just constantly rejected without cause. Anyway, because they threatened the paradigm, let's say. So I had all this amazing experience, this exposure, and thought, I was like, in my own journey, I thought, wow, light, this must be the thing. I found it. But then time went on, and I was running my business, traveling the world, had this freedom. I remember reading The 4-Hour Workweek from Tim Ferriss and thinking, man, I'm kind of doing this now. I get to go where I want, do what I want. And physically, I had felt significantly better. My symptoms had basically gone away from all this stuff I was doing between the diets, the light. But then I got to this point around about 2020 where, around the pandemic, where I still was feeling like internally something was off, like feeling empty, essentially, right? And I was asking myself, well, I'm doing all the right stuff from a circadian rhythm perspective, from a light perspective, right? I'm getting the right light. My neurotransmitters should be working correctly in my brain. My hormones should all be dialed in, and I'd get tests, and everything seems to be, within healthy ranges and everything. But just at a spiritual level, I was feeling like something's missing, like I'm feeling empty. And that's when I started to look deeper into Dispenza. I had read Ram Dass Be Here Now years before, and it was a mind-opening book, but I kind of went back to business as usual, right? I had been exposed to some really amazing spiritual people, and I knew that there was this other world, but I hadn't made the jump for myself. So I finally started looking into Dr. Dispenza and what he was teaching, and he was taking the science to a whole new level of how we can not only do things in our external environment, but we can actually cultivate our inner light, and that's the way I describe it. So the light diet, when I was first sharing this information, it's an evolution. It was all about outer light and external light. But for me, I realized the most important light for us to cultivate is our inner light, because at the end of the day, if you can make yourself, I believe if we can make ourselves strong from within and resilient from within, the outside world can't necessarily touch us, or at least if it touches us, we're prepared to handle it in a much more resilient way. And so for me, that's been really the journey. And the beauty for me of it is that I actually read this science when I was more skeptical. I read and understood, okay, we are electromagnetic. We can say we're beings of light. Light is electromagnetic waves. We're electromagnetic beings. We're beings of light. The research says that. There's other books. There's a great book, if anybody wants to read it, called Light Shaping Life, Biophotons in Biology and Medicine. It's like a textbook for those who are in the scientific mind, but it actually explains how our cells communicate with light. The stimulus for such a simple process or a basic foundational process as a cell division, the way we grow and expand and evolve, is little pulses of light. And they found this out by basically using the root of an onion and having it basically next to another cell. And if they put a glass slide between, this cell's division process wouldn't be stimulated. But then when they put quartz, which transmits ultraviolet light, the cell process would happen even with this material in between. And so they thought, okay, well, it's definitely light, something that's invisible that we can't see, but it's energy, it's moving, it's stimulating this process. And quartz transmits ultraviolet light. So they know, okay, our cells are communicating with ultraviolet light, which ironically is what they say causes cancer and all this bad stuff. Anyway, so for me, that's been the journey, and that's kind of what I'm diving more and more into lately. So that's been that's been my backdrop. Dope. Yeah,
I've been wanting to jump in here so much, but
please
I also wanted to
do.
Let you go.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah, I think Rockefeller purchased the American Medical Association, and I can say that pretty definitively now. You can find that out from a number of different resources, but that's when shit really shifted, right? And you know, it was a full court press on anything that wasn't backed from the big oil, you know. So if we couldn't make this, petrochemical pharmaceutical industry couldn't profit from it, that was going to be outcast. And there's a lot of medical doctors that were into new medicine and new science and the development of new drugs, but also relied heavily on the things that had worked in the past for them. And they threw a fucking fit, rightfully so. Like, hey, I'm down to try this new shit, but don't throw this other arm out. It works. And they were cast out as pseudoscientists and doctors, and some of them even imprisoned. There's black and white footage, video footage of doctors getting fucking thrown in jail, just you know, handcuffed back of the car kind of thing. So it's pretty fucked up, diving deep into that. And take that for what it's worth. You know, if you want to call that conspiracy bullshit, that's fine. But there's a trail of breadcrumbs there. Another piece that you brought up that's super important is I love the books that you mentioned. I haven't read them all, but Body Electric's phenomenal. One that I'll add to that is The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg. And I think that is such a phenomenal expose of what different frequency technology has done, right? And what we've seen. And you can't, you know, there's some of the main arguments are like, what do they say? Causation on it, like correlation does not equal causation. You can get into that, but let's just understand there's some pretty big coincidences throughout human history of when radio frequency was rolled out or when different technologies are rolled out that equated to people getting sick. And that doesn't mean that coronavirus comes from 5G, right? It also doesn't mean that 5G is off the hook and is making people healthy. It's not. And it also doesn't mean that we're fucked, right? Another point that you wanted to make on the outer light versus the inner light is super important, because if you look, and they mention this in The Invisible Rainbow, how is it that some people are relatively unaffected by Wi-Fi and everything, and some people are fucking crippled by it? Well, that's the argument on the outer light versus the inner light. You know, if I can control the variables externally, wearing raw optics and different things like that, I'm getting adequate sunlight, I'm putting the right food in my body, I'm going to bed on time, my circadian rhythm's set, I'm maybe challenging my body in different ways via heat and cold and different hormetic stressors. All those are the lifestyle choices that I can check off that help the epigenetic on-off switches. But it's still external in a way. And then I have this internal cultivation, right? But if I'm doing those things, they're affecting the internal as well. So that builds resiliency, right? And there are genetic components to everything, you know? So it could be a genetic thing on why some people just get fucking hammered, sick, you know, allergies, you name it. All the things start to go, autoimmune disease. A lot of these things start to go haywire if they're in a high energy zone versus somebody else who, you know, maybe, honestly for me, like I sleep fine in hotel rooms. I got biogeometry now and I fucking feel way different wearing it. You know, like I feel 100% better when I'm on an airplane with a biogeometry necklace than when I'm not. And I have no affiliation with them. I'm going to have them on, Dr. Ibrahim Karim, when he finishes his next book, and his daughter Doria are going to come on this podcast and really deep dive that. But I think there's a lot there on the outer and the inner light. And it is as basic as sunlight and as basic as food and as basic as sleep and exercise, you know, the last 4 doctors you'll ever need. And it's also as detailed as the shit that we're going to dive into with Dispenza's work. You know, like we're actually putting the mind to harness the attention towards something and the cultivation of something new, right? And then how does that extrapolate when I realize the steering wheel's in my hands and has been in my hands? How do I then steer the ship? So I'd love for you to break down, I know we touched on it a little bit in the last podcast, but it's been a long time. Break down some of the key implements that you've started to draw on from Dispenza and how that started to shift your understanding of reality and your understanding of what's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I really appreciate everything you've added here. So for me, my own story is it's so relevant, obviously, to me, but I think it can be relevant for other people. And there's a lot of resonance when I share this on podcasts, because I think a lot of people are going through very similar things, trying all the diets and everything, right? And so I had done so much from the external perspective, right? I went beyond the diets. I dove into the light. I was doing all the stuff right. And I was so I was, from, to your point, I was supporting myself from the external environment, but I was still struggling so much in my mind, in the way I was feeling every day. So I had to come to the conclusion since then that even if we're doing everything right from the external perspective, if our internal, let's say, compass is spinning in circles, we're going to struggle no matter what. And so the external, I think, can always add on top of a healthy foundation internally, but we have to have this internal foundation. Otherwise, we could do everything, but if we're constantly searching, Ben Greenfield put it really well for me one time. He said to me, man, as much as all of this stuff is so valuable, the biohacks, the ice bath, so many people are just searching and searching and searching for the next biohack, the next thing that's going to give them that hit. And ultimately, I think what he was implying, what I took from it, is that everybody's ultimately looking for God or some greater sense of fulfillment, some greater sense of connection. So when it came to Dispenza, I was one night, I had, for the first time in almost 4 years of starting my company and traveling, it was 3.5 years, I had been doing this and building this up and meeting some amazing people like yourself, meeting some really, let's say celebrities, athletes, people who I had never imagined I would connect with, much less so quickly in the beginning of the business. And so from that sort of superficial perspective, I was thinking, you would think that I have it all made. People say, oh, you're living the dream. It sounds like you're living the dream. But I would look inwards and say, well, I don't feel like it. If this is the dream, then I don't want this. I want something else. So I took a week out of my life. I went to this retreat, right? And Joe says, he says he doesn't want to make it about him. He wants it to be about the work and about the science and about you, about us, do everybody on their path. And so I took this time, I went in, and there's a lot of meditation, there's a lot of lectures of great information to basically explain how the science supports the fact that we are greater than we think, more powerful than we know, more unlimited than we could ever imagine, and how we can actually tap into that. And so, there's all these lectures, and for anyone who hasn't been at these events, as you mentioned, you haven't, it's a really cool experience because you have 1,500 to 2,000 people all there, open mind, open heart, ready to open up. Many people who are super skeptical, many people who are not. I met people who are corn farmers from Nebraska, like I shit you not. People who are just your average person, right? Not anything doctor, scientist, lawyer, biohacker, plant medicine shaman, or psychonaut, just normal people, literally, who drive tractors for a living. And they're like, I know that there's more. I want to, and I'll still do my job, but I want to bring more to it. And so, or maybe move to a new career, whatever. But so I had this amazing experience. I was doing all these meditations. It took me so much effort to leave my laptop back at my Airbnb where I was staying. Like, part of me was like, I'll bring it over. The first 2 or 3 days, I was like, I'll bring my laptop. I didn't do any work because I was full on at the event. Finally, I was like, I'm just going to leave my laptop back at home and surrender a little bit and open up and, realize that everything's going to be fine. And it always works out. So one night we were walking on the beach because Dr. Joe started doing these walking meditations to help people basically practice staying conscious with their eyes open, right? If you can do it with your eyes closed, great. But then the real practice is, can we do this stuff with our eyes open? And so we're doing this, and it's a really cool experience. You have 1,000+ people walking on a beach as sort of an exalted version of themselves, walking. Like, how would you walk if you were healed? How would you think? How would you feel if you were healed? And so there are people who have all sorts of severe illnesses in wheelchairs who actually, throughout even just a week, step up, get on canes, crutches, and eventually are even walking, even running. I've seen these people. It's almost unbelievable. And I've had people ask, oh yeah, don't they just pay those people? I'm like, I think there's too many of them, Yeah. But anyway, so I had this experience that night. First time I went to one of these events. I've been to, I think, like 9 now. Damn, I keep going back because I enjoy it so much. Yeah, it's for me, it's like, my version of going on a plant medicine
That's a
trip.
Fucking testimonial, though. That really is.
Yeah.
Have you done plant medicines yet?
Only once. I had a ceremony with San Pedro years and years ago.
All right,
and I remember
so you dipped your feet in the shallow end. There's nothing. I'm not going to shit on that experience, but I want to hear. I want to hear how this compares to something like a trip to Soltara.
Well, yeah,
Down the road.
I wouldn't be the guy.
When you're ready.
Yeah,
When you're
that's
ready.
right, exactly. So that being said, I'll tell you about a few of the experiences I've had that I think are worth sharing. But so this night, I remember feeling so much love. Like at one moment, I'm walking and I'm thinking, what's wrong with me? I can't feel it. I can't feel connected. What's going on? People here having brain orgasms, heart orgasms over here, and I'm screaming and I'm like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? And I finally just thought like, well, why don't I just try getting over myself? Just something clicked. And then I just looked at all these people around me and I was like, gosh, I just remember feeling so connected to everyone. I was like, I love these people. These are my people, right? These are amazing people like you, people who are out there trying to bring something higher to the world, right? And just express themselves in the best way they can. And everybody's like, even the person who's mean on the street or on social media, like I've found a new level of compassion when I would react, and I still react. Everybody reacts, I think. Joe says the question is, how long are you going to react for, right? But basically, I opened up. I felt this amazing feeling, and by the end of this walk, I felt so much love. I felt so whole that I actually wanted to call all of my family members just to tell them how much I loved them. It felt so natural, and I felt this just unbelievable feeling. And something just clicked for me in that moment, and I thought, well, I've been learning about these energy centers, or chakras as they've been called for thousands of years. The scientific name we could say is energy centers. But I've been learning about these energy centers, and I understood that most of the issues I had as a kid, health issues, were related to my gut, my sort of second or third energy center, depending on how you look at it. And I thought, well, when you live in chronic fear, survival, and stress, you basically close off that center. You sap all of your vital energy, which flows through the spinal column, and you put it into survival and pushing and forcing and, struggling and competing and stressing. And no matter how much I could do externally, there wouldn't have been energy for healthy digestion because I was constantly in survival. And, at an intellectual level, we can easily understand that. Like if you're in survival, you're not in a rest and digest mode. And I had realized that I was living so much in survival, and I thought maybe the reason I had so many gut issues wasn't because of all the stuff I was blaming, the food, the chemicals, the GMOs, the EMFs, the light, the artificial light, all this stuff. Maybe it was just the fact that I was living in constant stress. And it just somehow made sense to me in that moment. Like I could have done all this stuff, but I had to fix that fundamental issue. That's not to say that all these toxins and things weren't significantly contributing to these issues, but I thought I have friends who grew up in similar environments and this and that, but they didn't have the same issues, but maybe they didn't have quite the same experience of the world. They maybe had their own challenges, right? But this was my situation, what I was going through. And so it made sense to me, well, I'm going to do all the other stuff, but I had better get my system into coherence and start really practicing. There's this Blessings of the Energy Center meditation that Dr. Joe teaches, and people can go online and purchase it. And it's so valuable. And they've done this for thousands of years, even in traditional yoga. Kriya Yoga is an old, Paramahansa Yogananda and the autobiography of a yogi. One of the Kriya Yoga meditations, a friend of mine's a Kriya yogi, and he said he's sort of authorized to share this bit. Normally you get initiated and you get the full list and the full outline of all the meditations you can do. But he told me, I can share this one with you. This is something we're able to share. And it's just basically a very similar concept. You put your energy on each center and actually try to make it coherent. So to your point about, or your question about Dispenza, one of the most valuable things I've learned is this idea that if we put our attention on our different energy centers, we can actually give them more coherence, bring them into balance. And this is something that's, it's not just like one person who's talking about this, as much science as there is behind it. It's something that's been practiced for thousands of years. So now what I try to do when I meditate, there's two different kinds of meditations I like to do, but one is going through each center and trying to put attention on it, right? The old school way of doing it, as I was taught by this yogi friend of mine who lived in India for 6 years in a monastery, was going to be a monk. His masters ended up basically, let's say the way it works is that God has this idea and the masters sort of intuit it. It's not like they decide, but they actually intuited that he was meant to be a family man. So they told him one time, hey, listen, you'll meet your wife in 3 months. He was like, what? I was ready to be a monk. So anyway, really great guy, great friend of mine, but he explained that.
You fucking meet the wife?
I have, yeah, he did. She showed
That's
up exactly
dope,
when they
dude.
said 3 months later. She showed up in his
so
clinic, and he was doing his normal pulse test as they do in Ayurveda. They put their 3 fingers here on the wrist, and they're able to measure your different energy channels. It's kind of unbelievable, but I believe it from an energy perspective, right? But they can tell you so much about your vitals and the mucus in your system and your masculine, feminine, Ida, Pingala channels and everything. Anyway, and he said, he told me he felt that, and immediately he knew that this was the woman they were talking about. And then it's a really sort of funny extension of that is that she was head over heels, as the story goes. And he's a big doctor in Russia. He's not public, but he's from Russia and had lived in India many years and now travels the world and works with a lot of really high-level people. But basically, she sent in her mom, and just to kind of scope him out, right? It's like, what do you think about this guy? He does the pulse test, and he asks her, like, are you da-da-da's mother? Like, he knew just from the energy, and he kind of knew what she was getting at. So it was very funny. Anyway, so the way that version of blessing of the energy centers goes is going from your crown chakra all the way down and then bringing the energy back up rather than just starting from the base and bringing it up. I think there's value in every way of doing it, but just taking time to create that coherence. And Joe, he said one time that he would travel all over the world constantly because that's what he does, right? Spreading this message. And he found that he was just exhausted. And that by doing this, he could actually, no matter what he did, he would be fatigued because it's pretty draining. But to create this coherence, it actually worked. And I thought, I should try this too. I'm traveling a lot more for pleasure, but also meeting with people all over, connecting with people. And so I've started doing that. And that's been very valuable for me. So I think that's one from a practical meditation standpoint, just taking time.
Before we move on, can you dive in a little bit on that? Like, how long do you spend typically at each energy center? Does it matter per se? Is it something like, fucking third eye's lit, I don't even need to stay there, I'm just going to move down to the throat, and then the second question on that is, if you run into the feeling and you recognize something's not quite where it needs to be and you start focusing more energy there, does that then illuminate what's going on? Does it oftentimes show you where the trouble is? What's the blockage? What the fucking thing is that's impeding you?
I think we can actually feel that. And I think the more we practice this, for example, one general principle I could suggest, which is very universal, is trying to meditate early in the morning when you're in the more sensitive state, and or later at night, but also not being super full of food, because obviously if your body's digesting, it's just a little bit harder because that energy has to be focused on the digestive area, right? But so that being said, I just try to focus on each center. So the way that it was described to me from the yogic perspective is that we just want to basically feel there's sort of like a pulsation that we can actually feel. And I wouldn't say let's say on master level, right? We're all on the path, but I've been able to sense that feeling, this sort of energy. And I think anybody actually can when they really focus and hone in. So I try to just tune in and just feel. I use sort of imagination. So I imagine, like, what would it feel like if my crown was totally open, and I try to just open up to that. Now it might take a long time to get there, like maybe hours. So for me, I do what seems reasonable. So maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's 10 minutes, probably not too much less. Sometimes it's less if I'm just trying to go, like, okay. What I'll do sometimes at a minimum is if I'm, let's say, feeling busy. There's an old saying, like a Buddhist saying or something, that you should meditate 20 minutes every day unless you're really busy. Then you should meditate for an hour. And so when I'm particularly feeling like I have too much going on, that's when I think maybe I should stay a little bit longer actually and kind of get over this sense of anxiety or whatever is driving me to, this jitteriness, like I got to go do this and that, because whatever I go do from that state, I'm probably not going to do really well, or at least I'll do with that energy, right? So I try to go through, and then, for example, like if I'm on my throat chakra, I try to think, well, what would it feel like if I really felt like I was ready to go do a great podcast or like ready to go sing a great concert? I love to sing. I love to play my guitar. I brought my guitar just, for fun. Maybe we'll have a jam after for a song or so. But I know what it feels like when that center's working. And so I thought, okay, well, why don't I just try to get to that feeling? And sometimes I don't get there. Sometimes I do. But I think the effort counts, So even if you don't really get there, the effort has you're getting somewhere. So yeah, same with the heart. One of the amazing things that Joe has exposed a ton of research on is that in the same way that our genitals actually swell with blood when we're aroused, and we put our energy and attention in that area and they swell and there's life there and you can feel the energy, right? Like, everybody knows that feeling. Well, same chemicals actually can cause our heart to swell with blood and dilate and
engorgement,
exactly. And the heart can actually engorge, exactly, to get your heart on. So basically, that's actually something that's real, and I think everybody's felt that at some point, whether they're like in a way positively nervous for something, like you just kind of have that, like the butterflies almost. But I think everybody's felt at one time or another in their life their heart being open, and Joe says, well, why not make that a skill? Why not make that a skill like anything else that you could train? And I thought that was really cool. So I try to do the same thing for all the centers. And yeah, maybe it's 2 minutes, right? If it could be just 2 minutes or 1 minute all the way down, all the way back up, or even 30 seconds, just 5 or 10 deep breaths. Well, that'd be like a minute probably, but on each center, up and down, or even just 3 deep breaths. I think that could help people just get into the state they want to get into. So that works for me, definitely. And I'm working on practicing that more and more every day. Another meditation that I really like, and it's just dissolving basically into nothing. Now I have to say, people just have to go to Joe's retreats to experience this, and or go online, purchase one of his courses, purchase one of his meditations. Highly recommended. I believe this would be like tuning into potentials. Would be this one. But
that's my favorite, where he leads with like a quick recap on becoming supernatural. Then he has like a 7-minute Kundalini breath work where you Kegel, hold the belly in, breathe up, push through the crown, and then it's like 30, 40 minutes of him guiding you.
Yeah. So the part that I'm referring to that's my favorite. So there's Dr. Joe's breath, which is not mine to teach. He asks people not to try to teach all his stuff. So that's why I can give people a little bit of a summary of my experience, but people can go and they have a course, I think, now that teaches people that breath. Yeah, exactly. Kind of like Kegel exercise. But anyway, although it's different, but there's a sort of similarity there. The part that I love is this dissolving into nothing. So I was actually doing it in the car on the way over here. I just put in my headphones. I was like, I just want to dissolve into nothing. And yeah, there's great music playing, and it's just sort of letting go of ourselves. So not putting our attention and energy on any particular center, but just actually putting it all on nothing, or space is the term he used to use. And now it's more nothing. Yeah. Now it uses nothing in the more updated versions of the meditations. So feel nothing. And I've gained so much benefit from just dissolving into nothing, because then I'll come back to myself, I notice. And sometimes if I go really deep, I'll come back and it'll feel like I slept. It'll feel like I went to that level where I was totally out, because the brainwaves slow down, to that theta where you're almost asleep. You're kind of in between worlds. And then I'll come back and I'll be like, whoa. And somehow in that process, I find myself able to disentangle from, the programs, the things that we're attached to. And that's the whole idea behind meditation, is that we can actually slow down our brain waves. As it's been practiced for thousands of years, you slow down your brain waves, because when we're in this high beta state, we're reacting to everything in our environment. So beta brainwaves, we're active. We're probably both in beta right now because we're having a conversation. When people get into high beta, we're in absolute fight or flight stress mode. You can't think about anything clearly. And everybody knows that when you're in that state, you're going to say something you regret later. You're going to say that thing you shouldn't have said. So slowing down our brainwaves, on the other hand, is a way to disconnect from that. So when we're stressed, we put all of our attention on something like a threat in the environment, or if you had that, when you had the you told the story of the super poisonous animal that was right up on you, you're definitely you're in convergent focus in that moment. Like, okay, I better be really present with what's going on right here in the environment, otherwise I could have an issue. But then when we do the maximal divergent focus, which is putting our attention and energy on everything, nothing specific, but on just actually nothing, on space or energy, that's when the brainwaves can actually slow down. And that seems to be the scientific basis for meditation. And as the brainwaves slow down from beta down to alpha, that creative state, the daydream state where artists often live and where we are when we're daydreaming, when our inner world is more real than our outer world. And then even further down the brainwave scale is theta. And that's where our subconscious world basically dominates. So the subconscious mind is wide open, and we're programmable. And that's where they say kids live till they're like 5 or 6. They're just in theta. They're just soaking it all in. And so that's where we can get in meditation. And somehow, from my experience, when I've done that and executed it well, I've been able to come back and actually, whatever I was worrying about or whatever I was putting my attention on, by actually taking my attention off of it, I took my power back. And when we're stressed, we know that it's, at least in my experience, it's so hard. There have been issues in work, for example, where I'd put my attention on it for days or weeks. And actually, I give it all my attention. I'm giving all my power away to it. And so the hardest thing, let's say, in that moment is to actually just let go of that and take our attention off of it. But that's when we can actually think from a greater level of consciousness. So from a meditation standpoint, those are the two most practical things I found. And again, I encourage people, because Joe's the one who put the science together, put the work together. People go and actually either purchase the meditations, go to do the course, do one of the week-long retreats, and they can get that science directly from the source. Anyway, so that's been my experience from the meditation perspective.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I took a deep dive right after becoming Supernatural into a lot of his online stuff, and even combined a few of and I know he doesn't advise to do this, but I combined a few of his guided meditations with ketamine at various doses, and that was a fucking game changer, like nothing else. But I think as I started to really dive into meditation with Emily Fletcher, who I think now is doing some partnered work with Dr. Joe, at least on her entry point, she teaches the 3 M's: mindfulness, meditation, and manifestation. And, when she gets into the last part of manifestation, it's all Joe's stuff. It's hers too. It's not just Joe's. It's the great teachers that came before him. But it's fantastic. And I think those pairings, like what she's able to do in dropping, using the mantra meditation, which is the very thing I was doing when that snake came, is you are dissolving. And I think that, you can't try to enter the bliss field, as she says, but in doing so, you inevitably enter the bliss field because you fucking dissolve there. You don't try to get there. You just evaporate into it. And that can be an addictive thing because it feels fucking awesome to be nothing. It feels awesome to be weightless and not have the experience of a body and just fucking be and everything. I've had some of my most highest peak experience, MDMA, dancing, different things like that. And then just fucking fully dissolved meditating, dead sober, just like, holy shit, that's possible. Like I had no idea that was possible.
Yeah. For me, it's fascinating. And at the moment I'm in a place where I feel, just listening to my heart, I feel called to try to achieve those states through just meditation and see if it's hard to have a reference because I haven't done psychedelics, but you get to a state where I'm thinking, okay, this is probably what, some of these mystical experiences, let's say. And then maybe at that point, I'll have more of an interest to try, for example, some sort of plant medicine journey and just kind of compare and contrast. But for me, I really want to see how I can do that, if I can do that. And I think I can, just how through the meditative practice and see, because, great masters have done it throughout history. What you said made me think of I saw like an Instagram reel from Sadhguru not long ago, and it was just, he said something about each energy center. If your energy's here, you're going to be focused on, survival. If here, you're going to be focused on sensual pleasure. Your heart, it's creativity, et cetera, et cetera. Your throat, it might be education, speaking, whatever. But then he said from getting from the 6th to the 7th chakra, he called it the pathless path. So it's kind of like you said, you can't necessarily try. It's just, you have to sort of surrender. So for me, the journey even evolved because I got into Dispenza and I had this amazing experience and just felt like I don't want to go back to business as usual. I don't want to go back. Inevitably I've had, after these experiences, I've gone back to business as usual enough times, and that's why I told myself I'm going to keep going back, just to remember, to remind myself, take time out of my life and remember. And then I looked into Yogananda because I had gotten the recommendation of the autobiography of a yogi several times, but I hadn't taken the leap, let's say. And it's a really big book. Many people start reading it, don't finish it. So I felt like it was my time to check this out. And it was recommended to me by a friend who's in the tech world who had a relationship with Steve Jobs' wife because Steve had passed away. But he said, listen, Steve Jobs gave this book out to everybody at his funeral. 500 copies they had for his memorial service with the message, you realize yourself. And I thought, well, geez, I should probably read this book. It just, not just should, but I wanted to. It felt like the right time. So I looked into this. And have you read the autobiography of a yogi? So it's an amazing book. I think you would love it. And he goes through, so Yogananda is this great master from India, and he started out just as a young kid who just had this sort of pull for God. And in India, God is obviously, I would say, a much more common concept. There's all these rishis, these great sages and masters who have these abilities, and people there know about it. I've talked to many Indian people just in my travels. I was in Australia. I met a bunch of Indian people there who they talked about this, these mystical experiences and things as if they were just totally normal. And this wasn't a yogi guy. He was just a normal guy drinking a glass of wine and so on with a belly and everything. But he was talking about Shaktipat, which is the experience when the guru sort of blesses the disciple with this cosmic experience just by, like, for example, tapping their third eye or just sending the intention, and they can send people off into these apparently trip-like states, right? So like a journey. Anyway, so I was reading this book, and Yogananda explains how he went searching for his guru. Like he knew that he would find his guru. And so he met all these different masters with all these powers, but they weren't necessarily his master, the one who is meant to lead him in this lifetime. But the stories he tells are amazing. So the whole book is mostly just stories of all these different masters and monks in India. And of course, to somebody who has a more traditional approach to life, and especially coming from the West, from the US, people would think there's no way that there could be a guy who can, for example, use the power of his mind and put a scent on any object and it will never lose that scent. Like he could make this remote control smell like roses and it would just not lose the scent of roses until I guess he decided to take it off. It's pretty hard for people to believe. There's a monk, a chapter called The Sleepless Saint, of a master who just basically sits in ecstasy, God communion, samadhi, this cosmic bliss state, super conscious state, constantly, because he's mastered that through, I guess, his training.
I wouldn't come out if I fucking knew how to stay there. I mean, even it would be a hard draw. I think the only thing that could get me out of that state would be my kids. Mm-hmm. The only thing that would bring me back down, back to earth would be the grounding cord of fucking kids needing my support. Other than that, I'd be like, I'm fucking out, dude.
Well, that's a good father right there. It's a sign of a good father. Because so this doctor friend of mine, the yogi, he had. His name's Balarama, and it's a Hindu name he took, originally Russian, as I mentioned, but he had told me that there are even people who he'll teach and lead them through the different nutrition and all this stuff, and then meditation and so on, and get them to a certain level, and they actually get so drunk on this sweetness, he'll call it, of God, and that they'll even want to leave their families and go be a monk. And that's when he says, no, guys, now I reel you back. Like, you're in this world to be a family man. And he says, actually, if somebody has a family and they renounce all of that, it's actually from a karmic level, it could be seen as like the ultimate failure, actually. Like, that's our responsibility in this lifetime. And so it almost like, I guess in a way, selfishness in some way. So I think it's really good that you acknowledge that, of course.
Don't do what the Buddha did.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't think Buddha had kids, right? So,
I think he did.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, anyway, so it's not I'm not thoroughly knowledgeable about Buddha specifically. Anyway, so the sleepless saint didn't sleep. So like you said, he didn't even sleep. He just was in that ecstatic state. And to me, it makes sense from a biological, I should say bioelectromagnetic perspective, thinking about Becker's work. If we are these beings of light and electromagnetic energy, if we can master tuning into that state where we are basically beyond ourselves and connected to the field, they say it's within us and all around us, this energy that is everywhere. If we can connect to that and master that, it would make sense to me that our proteins wouldn't need all the repair that we need when we sleep. Because in the average day, we're wearing down our proteins and everything we need to sleep and repair proteins and mitochondria. If your cells are just gushing with life force energy constantly, I would imagine they just stay in this suspended state of
clean up,
function.
Detox. It's all on autopilot.
Yeah, it's working. Yeah, it's just working. So for me, I think that is a really interesting book. In fact, I know it's an interesting book. I think it's something that could be very interesting for other people who feel the call, right? So looking at this after already having more of a scientific foundation from Dispenza, I just thought, okay, well, this for me is the path. This is a path I want to pursue and learn more about. And so I've continued to travel. It's kind of a long story, but yeah, I've continued to travel. I continue to explore. I feel this call to explore, right? I just got to Austin. I'm like, I love this place. I want to stay here, honestly. But there's still this pull to go overseas. And I don't know exactly why. I imagine one day it'll all make sense. But right off the bat, I can say, speaking about RFK and the stuff he's sharing, and he gave me an understanding just in that podcast with Rogan that I didn't have. I've always asked the question, why are European people so much healthier on the whole? Like, there's so much less obesity. It's just unbelievable. Really, like, you go over there, you don't see a lot of obese people. And here it's like every turn, right? So there's something different. Why are the people, well, as a result, and I think the two must be connected, there's many more attractive people, right? Because if you have less sick people, then that, if you look at the bell curve of the population, if the U.S.'s curve is shifted where the average is closer towards disease, then, in Europe, the curve is shifted a little bit more towards health. There's going to be more people on that sort of, let's say, extreme of really healthy, like really good looking, really attractive, fit, vibrant. Not to say that we don't have that in the States. I'm hanging around Barton Springs. There's plenty of beautiful people, but in Europe, it's just like a whole different level. And I'm thinking, how different could their lifestyle be? I mean, somebody could make the case that, yeah, their genes are, sort of pure, so to speak, like they haven't mixed in. So somebody could make a case for that, but I don't really believe in that. I think
the mix would be better. You look at fucking dogs, right? The mutt won't die. The purebred fucking has all the issues.
Exactly. And I bring it up because not that that's what I believe, but somebody could make that case, but I don't believe that.
Well, you got French paradox. You got a whole bunch of stuff, where you're eating closer to home, whereas we are a hodgepodge of cultures, which even though that's available in every major city, like I grew up, there was ethnic restaurants everywhere. We had an large Indian community in Sunnyvale, large pockets of different Asian communities in Cupertino, the Korean bathhouse and Korean barbecue and Chinese restaurants and sushi and fucking Indian and Thai and all this stuff. And it's like, it's not, I enjoy those foods. They're fucking phenomenal. But that's not what my DNA is designed to eat. Like I'll eat it as a cheat meal, but and hopefully if it's Thai food, it's not going to fuck me up the way Chinese food will. But at the same time, that's not what my body wants. My body wants fucking meat and potatoes and maybe some dairy and fruit, and that's it. Like it doesn't want much other than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally would reject the genetic hypothesis as well. I think that genetic diversity is generally only advantageous for humans, and there's this whole understanding now in science that, and kind of the underlying basis of what we've been talking about this whole time, is that we can change the way our genes are expressed. So the genes are kind of like, I liken it to a grocery store, right? The genes are a grocery store. There's a lot of different meals you could make from that grocery store, right? You wouldn't blame the grocery store if you had a bad dinner. You'd blame the person who cooked the dinner, who picked the ingredients and didn't cook it well. The genes are this repository of so much information that can be turned on and off in so many different ways. And epigenetics is the science, of course, showing that we can modify our genetic expression. So to me, I'm thinking through the lens of epigenetics, there's got to be something about the United States that's really hindering our population. But I still, until listening to RFK on the Rogan podcast, it didn't strike me. And then at one moment when he was speaking, it just struck me like we live within this border essentially, and Canada and Mexico are pretty affected by what the United States does, and they have similar rates of obesity and diabetes. In fact, Central America is as well. But you cross the Atlantic and it's pretty different. They're so much healthier, but they don't have the glyphosate issue. They don't have the mercury in vaccine issue. They do have some issues related to these types of things, but not as prominent, right? The telecom is a pretty big issue everywhere. But so these are some factors that I believe have a much bigger influence than people think. I mean, especially talking about how much mercury is lodged in people's neurons based on the research. I didn't know a lot of that because studying vaccines hasn't been my thing. It's not something I want to get too much into because it's a little bit, more than a little bit controversial. But I wouldn't mind. I want to know about it for myself. It's not something that I'm particularly drawn to being like a public educator about. I think there's enough people doing that. I think I could do more about light, EMFs, et cetera.
Well, there is something there, and I was really happy that Bobby Kennedy went down the full rabbit hole on vaccines and not just the mRNA jab, which in and of itself has been we let the cards have been played, and we're still figuring out to what degree was there malicious intent. And I think, with the Pfizer reports and different things coming out, there's a lot that's going to be revealed there. But we know he didn't work. The fact that he went all the way back throughout history, I think, was a super important one. And there's a couple books that really shaped my opinion on that. One is called Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Susan Humphreys. It's a phenomenal read. And then two, diving into all of Dr. Thomas Cowan's work long before the pandemic really helped shape our decisions around how we were going to raise our kids. So he co-authored a book with Sally Fallon-Morell, the head of the Weston A. Price Foundation, the Nourishing Traditions book of baby and child care, and I absolutely love that. And of course, Thomas Cowan now has resigned as an MD, a 30-year medical doctor, just a fucking genius. So I'm going to get him back on the podcast. Background in anthroposophical medicine, Steiner study, understands biodynamic farming and all sorts of shit, all the way down and in between, Waldorf education, and he's been a big influence on us as well, even from like a Deschooling Society by Ivan Illich. He gave us that one when he was on the podcast the first time. Phenomenal book on education. So there's been enough people for us to make that question when we had Bear, and there's beyond enough evidence for us to say we're not going to do any of that. And looking at an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old who have perfect health and have never had a single fucking vaccine, there's proof right there. And it's like, well, it's going to cause everyone else to die of polio. Like, no, it's fucking not. Read these books, dude. Polio vaccine came out well after fucking polio's eradication.
Yeah. Yeah, it was fascinating for me. The way he explained it is that, the manufacturers went to Reagan and said, so this is just a direct excerpt basically from the podcast, but he said the manufacturers went to Reagan and said, listen, we have $20 of downstream liability for every $1 of profit we're making on the vaccines. And then Reagan said to them, well, why can't you just make a safe vaccine? And they said, well, and they went and said, vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. And that was written into the law that gave them immunity from all litigation in Congress. And then it was upheld, he said, and I think it was called the Brusewitz Supreme Court ruling upholding that statute. And so anyway, that's what they use. So he said anybody who's saying that vaccines are safe and effective, the industry themselves got immunity by clarifying they're unavoidably unsafe. And then Rogan jumps in and says, well, wouldn't the argument be that they've saved countless, untold numbers of lives of people? And then he says, yeah, that would be the argument. But the CDC's own data shows that that's not true, or it severely challenges that assumption or that idea. So it's very interesting, and I'm glad we're talking about this. Actually.
Yeah. I mean, I think people could. There's plenty of information out there if you just want to dive into it for yourself, rather than don't take my word for it. Don't take fucking Bobby Kennedy's word for it.
Absolutely.
Click on we'll have all these books linked to in the show notes. But I think that is a big factor. And a lot of people would say, well, why? You've been vaccinated. Why you're healthy? What's the problem there? And really, what RFK is speaking to is the Dole Act that went through. I think it was decided on and approved in the mid 80s, and it went through in 89. So depending on when you were born, you either got 10 vaccines in the course of your childhood or 72. And that 72 is now being added to, because even outside of emergency use authorization, and there's no longer an emergency, the COVID vaccine is going to be added to childhood vaccine schedules. So they're going to move up from 72 before they're 18 years old. And it's comical. It's absolutely comical. The regulation is tied to money. That's all there is to it, and there's absolutely no reason. He dove into that too on the podcast. There's no reason a kid needs a fucking hepatitis shot within 24 hours of being born. It's fucking absurd. Vitamin K, synthetic vitamin K, which is definitely not a good thing. They talk about this in the Nurturing Traditions book. Why would a kid need vitamin K? The reason Jews waited 8 days for the bris to circumcise was because that gave them enough time on mother's milk to build organically vitamin K stores in their body, so their penis would blood clot and they wouldn't bleed out from a circumcision. You eliminate the 8-day wait, you do it on day 1, vitamin K becomes standard, not just for males getting circumcision, but for all kids, male and female, when fucking females have no reason to have that whatsoever. And even if you decide not to circumcise, it's still pushed for. All this shit just becomes standard, and people don't understand why it was implemented in the first place. What good does it do? And that's synthetic vitamin K. I got a problem with that. I got a problem with a lot of the shit that they're doing.
Totally.
And the pressure of that. We've got a lot of friends that decided not to have any shots while they were there, and said they wanted to do it on their own schedule. And fucking Child Protective Services gets called. It's a thing. There's a medical mafia. It's not fucking. It's no longer hyperbole. It's not me just going on a rant about this stuff. Like I've heard from plenty of people about this stuff, and it is I love the fact that Bobby Kennedy is getting as much play as he is, whether he makes it in or not. Just because you read The Real Anthony Fauci. And it's one of those books where you're like, holy shit. And as Rogan said, the fact that he hasn't been sued says a lot. If there was anything incorrect in that book, they'd have fucking got him. And there, he had a team of 27 people, probably higher than that, but really, really rigorously verified every single thing that goes in that book. And the shit you read in that book is mind blowing. AIDS, all of it, just fucking mind blowing.
I'm very, very glad that was written. I actually haven't read it yet, but I'm very excited to read it. Yeah.
Buddy. Yeah, put that at the top of your list, dude.
Absolutely.
At the top of your list.
Yeah, it was funny. He was saying, he said, I don't even want my wife to read it. And I'm like, geez, I'm going to read it, but it's crazy.
It changes your view of the world. That's all there is to it. If I was to put it plainly, it changes your view of the world. And a big struggle for me from the plant medicine side over the last 3 years is coming to understand the world in the way that I do. and then still grapple with the as above, so below. What does that say about the totality, and then really having to circle back and hone my love for this life and the proof of that love as evidence from my family, my friends, the fucking life that I've built, the life that I've manifested and co-authored and co-created, right? That's undeniable as well.
I love it. And actually, I think it's a great way to turn the conversation as well, because so recently, I heard a podcast with Rick Rubin on his show Tetragrammaton interviewing a guy named Andrew Henderson. He sent me this episode. So Rick's a friend of mine, and he was basically saying, you should check this out. And I saw this name, Andrew Henderson. Who's this guy? And I looked at it. This guy started a company called Nomad Capitalist. So he's a very, very intelligent guy from, I think, like Chicago or actually Columbus, Ohio. And he just had this draw to travel the world and explore. And he started thinking, well, why not live abroad? And then there's all sorts of tax benefits. And so he created this company, Nomad Capitalist, that actually helps high net worth individuals and so on create ultimate tax structures based on their residencies, citizenships, et cetera. It's interesting. The United States is one of the only countries, along with, I think, North Korea and Eritrea, that taxes you based on citizenship. So even if I moved to Switzerland or the Cayman Islands or the Bahamas and I was living there, if I'm not paying any taxes to them, the U.S. would say, you still got to pay us those taxes. But if I'm in Spain where the taxes are higher, I pay Spain, and the U.S. says, all right, you're good. So as long as you're paying somebody, they don't care. But if you pay anybody less than you would have been paying the U.S., they're going to take the balance. So it's kind of nuts. So the only way to get out of that is either two things. One is go to Puerto Rico and get the exemption, stay there half the year, and you pay 4%, or renounce your citizenship, which is something I've actually thought about. But anyway, that's a different conversation. So one of the things Henderson says is like, my friends so he's lived abroad. He renounced his citizenship years ago, and he lives abroad in Malaysia and all these different places he talks about on that episode. But one of the things he said that really struck me as a very international global guy, I think he's in his 40s now, basically is that, he says, I'll speak to my American friends and it seems like there's always something wrong. And he's like, I don't even hear about that where I live, so that point is that me traveling as well, being outside of the U.S., I was outside of the U.S. just now for 351 days. I just came back, and so I was kind of out. Of course, I hear from people. I hear things. I see things on the news, but I don't actively seek it out. And it struck me when he said that because I felt, it's kind of true. When I'm out of the U.S., the world has its challenges in general, and there's certain things you're going to hear about irrespective, like a major shooting or this or that. Somebody will mention it. Or, for example, when the smoke from Canada was all over the eastern seaboard, right? But generally speaking, there's this different energy in a lot of places where people actually seem like, in some respects, more at peace with their life. Not to say that that doesn't exist in the U.S., but I thought, how cool is that there's actually places where people are just at peace? And that being said, within the U.S., I think we can choose, in some respect, our reality, right? We know there's a lot of negative stuff going on. I wouldn't want to encourage anyone to, let's say, deny or totally ignore, but at the same time, I'm entertaining the thought that there's some benefit to being disconnected. Like Tim Ferriss, in the 4-Hour Workweek, he talks about just not reading the news, right? And I would actually be curious on your thoughts about how do you balance, kind of staying out and not giving all your attention and energy to the negative stuff going on and appreciating the beauty, the farm, the family, and still being in the know enough to have an impact, help your friends and family, educate those around you.
Yeah, that's really been my alchemy for the last 3 years has been how do I toggle that? Because there was a point where you could say, I don't want to watch the news. Why do my parents watch the news? It's nothing but some fucking dude dying and something negative, right? Then the news went to social media and we were already hook, line, and sinker for it. So like now I unavoidably in my feed, I fucking see, it's really happened when I was at Soltara. Third largest milk distributor in Texas goes up in flames and it's a motherfucking mushroom cloud on video. And woke people are writing methane and this and that. It's like, no, there's no methane there, dude. They just fucking blew up and there's 120 now meat or food processing centers in North America that have gone up in flames in the last 2 years. That's news to me. Why? That's going to affect us,
know nothing
right?
About that.
Yeah, so that's news and it's worth knowing. Eventually, with the globalization of the world, there is potentially, the fact that the whole thing can be affected at once. And that was lockdown, right? The whole world fell into line to try this thing out in the best way they thought possible, whether it was planned or not. And that affected everyone. I couldn't I got kicked out of Barton Springs with my son we were out in the water and they didn't kick out the guy on the paddleboard. And then I found out about maritime law and a whole bunch of other shit, fucking Commonwealth law, but the cops couldn't kick him off because they were sea dwelling. Basically, they were on a fucking
in Barton Springs.
Yeah, not at the Bark Park side, right?
Yeah,
going to the Colorado River. They were on a body of water, and they were on a vehicle on a body of water, so they were cool. And so we bought stand-up paddleboards. That was our fucking workaround. But it's really interesting to have all that unveiled, and then how do you balance that? Because I can say fairly certainly that all rabbit holes are infinite. And if you really go down the rabbit hole of darkness, there's no bottom place where it bottoms out and you're like, now I discovered it all. Like it just keeps revealing more and more and more. And Charles Eisenstein did the same thing. And it's that's no place to live. It'll destroy you. And it absolutely sucks all joy, all hope, all faith out of life. And so the counter for that for me has been a couple of things. One, the agape, the love of my brothers, and the love of family, the love of that connection. But it's also been, this last trip to Soltara, it's been a reminder of the joy and the sweetness of life, which is participating in that. It's the ecstatic dance. It's the holotropic breath work. It's, having fucking kratom and hanging with my friends. It's going out, in the water with my kids. It's doing a little fucking nature walk like we just did and spotting one of the hawks or some of the cool, being in tune with that, right? And I think that's been one of the major things. I had a journey with Wachuma, which was very light, but it was very heady, and I was very grappling with some of these concepts, like what is the totality? What does it look like? And right then I ran into the red stag, like 20 yards, and I was like, oh shit. And then I could see the intelligent design and everything around me, and really feel into the brilliance of what nature is, the brilliance of the intelligent design of the universe, and understand like this is the harmony that I've been seeking. And it's inside me too. But if I'm dwelling on the negative, I'm going to live there, right? I can stay there as long as I fucking want. God says yes to every experience, and it'll keep saying yes, and it'll keep delivering the same experience as long as I want to hold that experience. So for me, the balance point has been not just in balancing my love for family and, the big key grounding chords that I have, but also in participating in the joy and the bliss of what's available to me right now. And solving what needs to be solved. Should I prepare for the grid going down? Why not, man? I've got the means. Let's fucking try that. Should I prepare for food storage without refrigeration? Sure, we can teach about that shit. That's a good idea. That adds to our education piece at the farm. Let's try that. So there's many, many ways in which I can kind of cover the bases loosely, but mostly it's a reframe. What do I want to experience in this moment? And if I'm searching for peace, it's probably because I'm fucking taking in a lot of dark shit. I don't watch the fucking news because for that very reason. So the disconnect, as you talked about and Ferris talked about, the disconnect, it's a priority for me to live how I want to live. It's a priority, and that means way less social media. It means, I'll peek my head in there, and then fucking if I get 5 minutes in, I'm out. It's got to be out quick, and there's touch points, and if it's a big thing like the food processing plants, I'm going to have a friend talk about it. Tim Kennedy's a buddy. He was talking about that. And different people will bring it up on different podcasts, and I'll look into it, verify it, and then I'll pull back out. I'll chew on that. Like, what does that mean for me? It means I should probably have access to my own food. It means I should know my farmers. It means I should do some little extras there where I get connected. The things I've already been doing, going to a bison harvest at Rome Ranch with the Force of Nature guys. Fuck yeah, let me split a half a cow with you. Awesome. And that's something I'd do anyways because of the best food that I'm going to feed, my family. That's what Wolf was built on when she was in my wife's womb. She was built on that bison, the regenerative bison from Rome. So I think it's tricky because there's a juicy quality to everything, and if you're looking for, I think a big problem for people, myself included, is that up until 2020, it was like you're searching for more, something feels off, and then somebody points to what's off, and you're like, holy shit, that's it. That's wow. All right, this is way off. And you just can't take too long in that space. You have to circle back to why it's beautiful, why it's worth it, what makes it worth it for you, and then finding your purpose in that. Dale Bigtree has been awesome, man. He did the documentary Vaxxed. He's been on this podcast. He recently went on Aubrey Marcus's podcast. And one of the things he said is like, there's no, if you're a freedom fighter, if you're somebody who loves humanity, if you're somebody who loves nature, if you love the sweetness of life and you recognize the beauty in that, there's never been a greater time to be alive. There's never been one that mattered more. There's never been a calling to greatness more than in this moment, to speak the truth, to teach the truth, to live the truth. And I think that's a really powerful, calling for many of us. Is like, this shit matters. What I'm saying on this podcast matters. Who I'm educating, how I'm being educated, what am I continuing to do, which seeds am I planting going forward? They're going to offer a better way forward, and really creating. We get to design the more beautiful world. Let's do it.
I love that, brother. You say that, and I'm thinking, I had the thought not long ago, there's all this sort of super villain-esque figures right now in the world, or these types of energies going on. And I just thought to myself, well, then the world just needs more heroes, right? That's it. So that's really exciting for me. And you mentioned the sort of the great going down, I think you said, this potential, let's say, collapse. And I thought about that a lot, like, what if the grid goes down and everything, right? And then in the same moment, I just had this thought, well, what about also at the same time preparing for the great going up, like things are lifting up. And that's another thing I've seen and experienced in traveling. There's so many things that to me give hope about the future. For example, I'm a big fan of Bitcoin. Some people would say it's a sort of controlled opposition created by the CIA or something like this. And about this, I don't know. Maybe you do, but
I've heard that shit too. But I got Bitcoin.
Yeah,
I'm not big into crypto, but I got Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I'm more of the mindset when we talk about Bitcoin of Bitcoin as a really revolutionary technology, and all the others, they call them shitcoins in the Bitcoin world at least, or altcoins, less profanely. But basically, they are all kind of copycat technologies that are centralized. They're not, Bitcoin's the only truly decentralized cryptocurrency, or it was the first, of course, or the first one that took off. And to me, that gives me a lot of hope, because for those who have really studied Bitcoin, and I've dove relatively deep into some of the technical aspects and the science and the potential. A lot of people in that world say Bitcoin fixes this, and this. Like, people can actually take back their money, where the government lives off of basically not only taxation, but off of inflation. So they're basically siphoning. So it's nuts when you think about it. If you're making a lot of money, you're already paying, even if you're not making a lot of money, but if you're making good money, you're paying 35% of your income as taxes. Even people are paying 15, 20%. It's a lot of money, right? And then in addition to that, they're siphoning off the more money from the currency just by printing more of it. So they're taking, I don't know the exact percentages, but with every year they print more money, and they printed like trillions, obviously, during COVID. They're just devaluing the rest of the currency significantly. I read somewhere that just during COVID, they printed something like 50 to 75% of the US dollars ever. They weren't actually printed, they're just numbers in a computer, right? But they created, and that was 50 or 75% of all the US dollars ever created since 1776. So right there, if those numbers are correct, which I believe they are, the range, I don't have the exact number, but the range is accurate. That means that all of our money went down by something like 30 to 50% in real value terms, because they've created such a surplus. Now, how long does that take to actually catch up as far as increasing prices and everything? Because it increases at the level of physical goods, like raw materials for manufacturing, et cetera, production. And so eventually those price increases come to the consumer, to us. It just takes time. So if people saw the jump in real time, there'd be riots in the streets. But so since it's slow, the government lives off of that. With Bitcoin, with this idea, at least, people control their money. The government can't just take it and make more money for themselves by devaluing everyone else's money. It actually gives power back to people. So something like Bitcoin gives me a lot of hope about humanity. The president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, what he's doing gives me a lot of hope for humanity. There's a great book called The Sovereign Individual, which was recommended to me by a big tech CEO guy, and who's actually not in that world, I think, of the control and this and that, but actually is a sort of freedom fighter for humanity. And anyway, basically said, this is a book you should check out. And I checked it out, and it's fascinating. In this book, The Sovereign Individual, they talk about, these two authors talk about how, given some new technology, so encryption technology and digital currency, people actually have the technical means now to make money outside the reach of governments and store their money outside the reach of governments, which has never existed before. So if you worked at a factory in the 1800s or early 1900s, the tax guy would stand at the door, at the gates, and collect income taxes on the way out. Like, that was it. And obviously, he might not have a gun, but if you didn't pay, somebody's going to come to your house with a gun. And if you don't pay them, they're going to put you in jail. So it's basically coercion, extraction by force. even. And so it's like it is like. So I was telling somebody about this, and they said, "So it's like a mafia," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. It's like a sanctioned mafia."
There's a fucking fantastic book on this subject that Luke Story put me on to. It's called The Most Dangerous Superstition.
Yeah, he just recommended that to me too, and I'm actually reading it now. It is
fucking awesome, dude. It is so good. It's by Larkin Rose. I'm listening to it on Audible. It's read by somebody other than the author, but the narrator's great. So can keep going.
But that's the idea. So when I mentioned this, so Bitcoin's super promising. So in the sovereign individual, they basically foresee that given, so the way, I mean, just at the high level, they explain that all government is essentially a monopoly on the use of force. They don't say this exactly, but they say it in similar terms. And this is very much the mindset behind a lot of the libertarian communities, is that government is just, again, and this is Larkin Rose in that world. So they just have a monopoly on the use of force. So like if a police officer pulls a gun on me and then I pull a gun back on him, like he, according to the structures that have been created, he has the right to shoot me. And
that's due to the myth of authority.
Exactly, the myth of authority. But that's exactly right. That's the idea. And so in the book they explain how technology changes what they call megapolitics. So megapolitics are the structures that precede politics. Meaning, are you living in a kingdom or a chiefdom or a tribe or a democracy? These are mega political structures. And then politics happen within that. Who's going to be the king? Who's going to be the chief? Who's going to be the Democrats or the Republicans, right? Who's going to control Congress or the Senate? That's all politics. But mega politics are how the structures change. And they explain in the book that mega political structures always change based on technological changes. So it's not like the Democrats or the Republicans can actually change the way megapolitics are going. They have no power, no control over that. Even though some people deep in that world think that we're actually going to create those changes in a political way. So for example, when we were living in tribes, the main technology was basically hunter-gathering. It was like the Stone Age, hunter-gathering. So the most, let's say, natural form of governance was tribes at the time. There were chiefs and so on. Now, they talk a lot about what's called the returns to violence because governments are based on violence, the use of force to extract, for example, taxes. So there was a change in technology. Agriculture came along. And so people actually, pretty much the first time in history, had to stay in one place to tend to their crops, obviously. And they had to use irrigation or get water from a river. And so once you're in one place, you're a sitting duck, of course, for anybody who wants to use force. And so this is the original civilizations in Egypt. The governments that basically took over were those who had the monopoly on the use of force in those regions. Whoever can kind of win out over the other people using force and control those people who are actually producing. So like I would say in a sense, the good guys are those who are working the land, producing something of value to feed their families and their communities, et cetera. And then these guys with guns, well, then it wasn't guns, but you know what I mean, swords and so on, spears and sticks and arrows, they come along and say, listen, if you don't pay us a third of your grain, we're going to cut you off and you're going to starve to death. We're going to cut off the irrigation or just basically kill you. And so that's how the original governments essentially formed. I mean, I'm certainly simplifying it. But anyway, technology shifted to, over time, there was the industrial age, which is a huge shift. So it happened fairly recently. And then that changed the mega political structures where the nation state became the most favorable structure. So before the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot more small kingdoms. Even in Germany and all these places, it was more kingdoms. And then these states, because then the state could only compete with the states around it based on how much power it could amass within its borders. And crazy stuff. I've always been fascinated by languages. And language is super fluid. Like you cross Europe, there's so many different dialects. You could drive 20 miles and be in a place where they speak a totally different dialect. And so what nation states were incentivized to do was to basically weed out dialects, because if you can get everybody speaking the same language, you can control the collective consciousness within those borders. Like you would never ever have in Europe prior to nation states, like you cross a border from France and Spain and now they all speak a different language. Like it would have been much more fluid, and there were all these different dialects. But so and this blew my mind because I love languages. I never thought about it like this. One of the qualities of nation states was to root out other languages. So, for example, Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain for several decades during World War II, they were neutral, but he had that kind of control. He murdered anybody who spoke Basque, the Basque people, or Catalan. They would kill people just for their language because, again, it's kind of a way of dissonance. Anyway, so this was fascinating. So they explain this in the book. They go through a lot of it. But then the biggest shift more recently was from the industrial time. You had a factory. You couldn't run away from the government. You have to have a physical place. So the point is technology has changed to, again, encryption technology and digital currency. For example, they predicted digital currency 10 years before Bitcoin even started. And they say, it doesn't necessarily matter how long it takes, but the technology has changed, and we're sure that this is going to cause a change in the way the world is organized. And what they anticipated, this is coming from Bukele and what he's doing in El Salvador, governments eventually, when people wake up to this fact, governments are actually going to have to start competing on fair market terms, because there's nothing else where people spend money and they don't get, like, for example, if you went to the grocery store and they try to charge you $100 for a bottle of water, you'd be like, I'm just not going to shop here. But with the government, you don't really... we do now, but previously we didn't have the option to say, well, you want to take 30% of my income, well, I'm just going to go somewhere else. But now we actually have that ability to do that. And the idea is that governments eventually, when enough people wake up to this reality, are going to have to start competing with one another on fair market terms, just like any other industry. So they're technically, they say, in the industry of protection services. Like, that's what mafia is, basically. You pay protection money. So, okay, you pay us, we're going to protect you from foreign invaders, we're going to build roads. But, 30+% or 20% plus of anybody's income just to build roads, it's so much money. Everybody knows how inefficient the government is. But speaking of this book, I've only just started it, but we're all in the belief that we have to support the racket. And that's why the racket exists, because everybody still believes they have to support it. Anyway, so it's a fascinating book. And the reason I bring it up, again, about El Salvador is that Bukele's creating this kind of state where it's actually incentivizing people to move there. So I think that's really the whole point behind that, is that there's a lot of positive developments in the world that I see happening. And and I'm only clued into a small fraction of them. I've heard there's some amazing stuff happening in the world of energy production, right? Like beyond solar, super, like nanotechnology, amazing stuff. Climate, things to improve. I'm not the guy who's going to create a big panic about CO2 and all that. That's not my thing. I'm not inclined to believe that narrative, let's say. Not that we should pollute the environment, though. I'm a fan of, you wouldn't want somebody dumping lead
clean
near
water,
you,
clean
right?
Air, clean soil.
Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, there's positive stuff happening there. And I think there's a potential that in our lifetime, we make the right decisions, things could be really good.
Yeah, no doubt. I think what we're witnessing now is something I brought up on our walk, and then we're at close to 1:30 here. So
okay, yeah.
We'll wrap it so we can get this run together.
Absolutely.
Joel Salatin talks about this a lot. A lot of people in the regeneration game. You have life and death, decomposition, regeneration. And that's really speaking to the cycles of nature, right? Life, death, decomposition, regeneration. And, we actually can see that, in some level, regeneration in the spring, life in the summer, death in the autumn, decomposition or pause in the winter. And the cycle starts over and over and over again. We see that in As Above, So Below. And I think that's what we're witnessing right now on a longer timeline. So it looks like the end of the world. It looks like the apocalypse. But we're witnessing the death. COVID showed fucking super well all the cracks in the system. CRT being taught in fucking public school shows that the death of public school is fucking just imminent. Like it's gonna.
What does CRT stand for?
Critical race theory.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Which flies right in the face of Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings, right? And Douglas Murray illustrates this perfectly in The Madness of Crowds. Highly recommend that book for people. But we're witnessing this, the death and the decomposition of these things. And if we open our minds and our hearts to what's coming next, that's regeneration. So literally, it's what fucking seeds do we want to plant that replace these systems? And hopefully, we can get parallel systems in place ahead of time. So we're not just dealing with the rubble, but we're actually able to coordinate things that run tandem to the death of these systems. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a holy shit, what do we do now to keep the lights on? What do we do now to put food in our bellies, right? And I think that is, that's really the game we're in right now. And it's a fascinating time. I
agree. Two more things. So one is that I think people listening to this, your audience, my audience, there's this mindset that I have seen. I'm sure you've seen it too. It's this mindset that things are going in a really bad direction, right? It's kind of obvious with everything happening. As you said, it is happening, right? And we shouldn't ignore it. But to have this mindset that, we could actually also be on our way into a golden age. Like we could all be thinking, just the thought, as Dispenza would say, you just have the thought. And the thought starts creating sort of these ripple effects in the quantum field where you can actually bring that reality to you with the strong enough, elevated emotion from your heart, the magnetic, charge in the field, let's say. So we can actually have more and more people. I think if we have more and more people thinking like, what if the future, just asking the question, what if the future were really bright? Like, what business would I be starting? What industry would I be getting into to build that parallel system? I think that's a very powerful thing. And the last thing is, I mentioned I went on this walk, the Camino. So we'll talk about it more in detail later in a future episode. But I did this pilgrimage, for those listening, 500 plus miles across almost all of northern Spain. I walked every day for 30 days for about 15 to 18 miles. It was a really amazing experience. And one of the main takeaways in regards to our conversation, I remember walking at one point after leaving the city of Burgos and in northern Spain, and I was on my way into this region called the Meseta, which is basically 250 miles or so of just flat fields. So I went from the mountains to La Rioja, surrounded by where the wine comes from, surrounded by vineyards and olive trees. It was like, wow, felt like I was in Tuscany or something. And then after you pass through Burgos, you get to this region called La Meseta, which is just, I'm like, okay, I know I'm going to be walking for 14 days through nothing, just wheat fields. And I remember leaving the city thinking like, wow, this is going to be quite the trip. But at one moment it struck me, I was like, there is so much space out here. Like, there's this kind of cry of overpopulation and all this stuff. And that's part of that, let's say, New World Order type of agenda, like, oh, overpopulation. I'm thinking to myself, if you drive by car, you fly, you don't realize how much space there is. If you just walked from Austin to Lockhart, you'd realize how much space there is. And then you walk from Lockhart to Lubbock, you'd be like, okay, there's a lot of space. There's a lot of space on this earth. I believe what I'm getting at with that is it just opened my mind to the potential that I think we really can create anything like this place. Even if some of the world decides to go one direction, I think those who want to create a better world can go another direction. And I had a similar thought as I was leaving just from Costa Rica on Monday to fly here. I was thinking to myself, there was a time when the same sun it just struck me. There's the same sun that would rise on Europe, and Europeans would have their whole entire universe. The same sun would rise 6 or so hours later over Central America and the Incas, and they lived in a completely different universe under the same sun that was rising over Europe that same morning. And I just thought, that's a trip. Like, it was, because they live in these different universes in a way, and now we can just hop over in an aluminum can. But so that's to say, I think we can create our world the way we want it to be, no matter what.
Fuck yeah, brother. Yeah. Well, it's been excellent having you on,
brother.
Dude. I love you, brother. It's always a fucking blast.
Likewise.
Your company, Raw Optics, is the very best in fucking blue light blocking glasses. You've got some awesome stuff. You've been a long-time sponsor of the show, so I want to plug you guys. Where can people find you online, and where can people get hooked up with the best in blue light technology?
Thank you, brother. So rawoptics.com. So yeah, people can purchase our products there, rawoptics.com. And on Instagram, we've recently been putting up a lot of new content there, so raw_optics. And then if people want to follow me, it's just The Light Diet on Instagram. So sort of a diet of focusing more on light and even in the inner light sense.
Beautiful, brother.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Fuck yeah, brother.